The stage of World War II was vast, spanning continents and oceans. Its battles were fought by millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. But the war itself was conceived, orchestrated, and driven by a handful of men. Their decisions, their ideologies, their pathologies, and their personal rivalries dictated the fates of nations and the lives of generations. To understand the cataclysm, we must venture beyond the maps and the troop movements, into the dark and labyrinthine corridors of power and personality. We must step inside the minds of the leaders who started the war. This is not a story of strategy alone, but of ambition, hatred, delusion, and the terrifying power that resides in the hands of a few flawed individuals. The story begins not in a grand chancellery, but in a crowded flophouse in Vienna. A young failed artist named Adolf Hitler, bitter and rootless, wanders the streets of the multicultural Habsburg capital. It is here, in this cauldron of ethnicities, that his worldview hardens. He immerses himself in violently anti-Semitic and pan-Germanic literature, developing a core belief that would define his life and plunge the world into war. A conspiracy theory that a Jewish Bolshevik plot was responsible for all of Germany's and the world's ills, and that the Aryan race was locked in a Darwinian struggle for survival against inferior peoples. The defeat of Germany in World War I and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles were not political or military failures to him. They were proof of this conspiracy, a stab in the back by Jews and Marxists. This paranoid narrative became the unshakable foundation of his mind. Hitler's rise to power was a masterclass in manipulating a nation's trauma. He was not a polished statesman. He was a performer, a demagogue who understood the raw power of emotion over reason. His speeches were not policy discussions. They were theatrical crescendos of rage and promise. He channeled the German people's humiliation, their economic despair during the Great Depression, and their yearning for a return to greatness. He offered them a scapegoat and a savior. He promised to tear up the Versailles Treaty, restore Germany's military, and secure Lebensraum, living space, in the East, which he believed was the Aryan race's natural birthright to be taken by force from the subhuman Slavic peoples. His mind did not operate on the logic of diplomacy, but on the imperatives of a racial holy war. As Führer, Hitler's psychology became the state's guiding principle. He cultivated an image of infallibility, a lone genius operating on a higher plane of destiny. He was deeply suspicious of the traditional German officer corps, whom he saw as aristocratic and cautious. His military decisions were increasingly driven by this intuition, which he called his iron will. Early successes, the bloodless annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia at Munich, convinced him of his own genius and the weakness of the Western democracies. He saw their leaders, Chamberlain and Daladier, as little worms who would always back down. This perception made the invasion of Poland not a gamble, but a logical next step. When Britain and France finally declared war, he was reportedly surprised and angered. They had failed to play their assigned role in his psychological script. During the war itself, Hitler's mind became both his greatest weapon and the Reich's greatest liability. His audacity and willingness to risk everything gave birth to the Blitzkrieg and the fall of France. But as the war progressed, his deep-seated paranoia and need for total control strangled his military. He micromanaged armies from thousands of miles away, refusing to countenance retreat under any circumstances. The disaster at Stalingrad was a direct result of his hubris. He believed his will could overcome the reality of a trapped army and a Russian winter. His mind, which once so focused on a grand, if monstrous vision, began to fray under the pressure. He retreated into a world of fantasy, relying on non-existent miracle weapons and imaginary armies. In his final days in the Berlin bunker, he raged against the betrayal of his generals and the German people themselves, whom he deemed unworthy of his leadership. The mind that had envisioned a thousand-year Reich ultimately could not bear to witness its collapse, ending its own story in a subterranean room, a testament to the self-destructive nature of absolute power married to absolute ideology. If Hitler was driven by a messianic hate-filled vision, his Italian counterpart, Benito Mussolini, was motivated by something both simpler and more shallow, a desperate craving for prestige and a place in the sun. The self-styled Duce had pioneered fascism, seizing power in Italy in 1922 with his Black Shirts' March on Rome. He preached the glories of a new Roman Empire, of martial vigor and national rebirth. But for all his bombastic speeches and theatrical posturing, Mussolini's Italy was an economic and military paper tiger. His mind was that of a propagandist, not a strategist. He understood the aesthetics of power far better than its mechanics. Mussolini watched Hitler's rise with a mixture of envy and apprehension. Initially, he saw the Austrian upstart as a junior partner, even moving troops to the Brenner Pass in 1934 to prevent Hitler's first attempt to absorb Austria. But as Nazi Germany grew stronger and the League of Nations proved impotent, his calculus changed. He craved easy victories to bolster his regime. The brutal invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, using poison gas against a poorly armed foe, was a classic Mussolini operation. Grand in ambition, brutal in execution, and designed for headlines. The following condemnation from the West pushed him into Hitler's waiting arms, forming the Axis alliance. Mussolini's mind was plagued by insecurity. He feared being sidelined, of missing out on the spoils of what he saw as Hitler's inevitable reshaping of Europe. This shadow complex drove his most disastrous decision, declaring war on a defeated France in June 1940, a blatant and cowardly stab in the back. He told his generals, "I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." This statement reveals the core of his leadership, war as a theatrical prop for his personal prestige. His subsequent military adventures were a cascade of humiliations. The Italian invasion of Greece had to be bailed out by the Germans. His armies in North Africa were routed by a much smaller British force. The Italian soldier, often brave and resilient, was betrayed by his leader's incompetence and the nation's lack of preparation for a modern industrial war. As the war turned against the Axis, Mussolini's power and mental state crumbled in tandem. He became a puppet of Hitler, reliant on German troops to prop up his regime. The Allies invaded Sicily, and his own Grand Council turned against him. King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed and arrested him in 1943. Rescued in a daring German commando raid, he was installed as the figurehead of the Nazi-controlled Italian Social Republic in the north, a broken man presiding over a bitter civil war. In his final days, captured by partisans, the illusions were finally stripped away. The man who had strutted on balconies before cheering crowds was executed unceremoniously, his body and that of his mistress subjected to public fury in Milan. Mussolini's mind, a palace of vanity and empty rhetoric, had led his nation to ruin and himself to an ignominious end, a tragic lesson in the hollowness of unchecked ego.
In the Kremlin, a different kind of tyrant watched the rise of fascism. Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, had spent the 1930s consolidating his power over the Soviet Union through a reign of terror. His mind was a fortress of paranoia, shaped by his background as a Bolshevik revolutionary and his insatiable thirst for absolute control. The Great Purge of the late 1930s, which saw the execution or imprisonment of millions, including most of the Red Army's senior officer corps, was a product of this mentality. Stalin trusted no one, and he believed that by eliminating all potential rivals, he made himself and the state secure. This left the Soviet Union critically weakened on the eve of the world's greatest military confrontation. Stalin was a ruthless pragmatist. In 1939, despite his ideological opposition to Nazism, he saw a pact with Hitler as a temporary necessity. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a cynical masterstroke from his perspective. It gave him a buffer zone in eastern Poland and the Baltic states, and, he believed, precious time to rearm the Soviet Union. He was so convinced of its durability that he ignored a torrent of warnings from his own intelligence and from Winston Churchill about the impending German invasion in 1941. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22nd, Stalin suffered a nervous collapse. He retreated to his dacha, seemingly incapable of action, for several crucial days. The greatest strategic blunder of his life was a product of his own supreme arrogance. He believed he could outmaneuver Hitler, and he was wrong. The invasion shocked Stalin back into a terrifying reality. His response was to unleash a ferocity that would come to define the Soviet war effort. He issued Order Number 270, declaring any soldier who surrendered a traitor, effectively condemning millions of Soviet POWs to death. He mobilized the entire Soviet state for the Great Patriotic War, a struggle not for communism, but for the survival of the motherland. His mind, while still paranoid, became focused on a single goal: victory at any cost. He learned to trust, to a degree, the military professionals he had not purged, like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, giving them the latitude to plan the great counteroffensives at Stalingrad and Kursk. He proved to be a master of the grand strategic scale, relentlessly focused on the mobilization of industry and manpower, moving entire factories east of the Urals, out of reach of the Luftwaffe. At conferences like Tehran and Yalta, the other Allied leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, met a man whose mind was utterly alien to theirs. He was inscrutable, patient, and relentlessly focused on Soviet post-war interests. He was already fighting the first battles of the next war, the Cold War, as the current one raged. He demanded a buffer of subservient states in Eastern Europe, a demand the West could not refuse given the Red Army's presence on the ground. Stalin's mind, which had brought his country to the brink of annihilation through purges and miscalculation, also steered it to unimaginable sacrifice and ultimate victory. But the peace he secured was not one of freedom, but of Soviet domination, creating an empire built on the bones of 27 million Soviet citizens and casting a shadow over Europe for the next half-century. His was the mind of a survivor, who ensured his state's survival by sacrificing its people and enslaving its neighbors. In May 1940, as Nazi panzers sliced through France, Britain turned to a man who had been a voice in the wilderness for a decade. Winston Churchill was a complex, romantic, and often difficult figure. His mind was a vast storehouse of history, literature, and a deep, unwavering belief in the British Empire and its civilizing mission. He had warned tirelessly about the menace of Hitler throughout the 1930s, his speeches dismissed as warmongering. Now, in Britain's darkest hour, his time had come. His primary motivation was not an abstract ideology, but a ferocious, almost spiritual love for his country and a fundamental conviction that tyranny must be resisted. Churchill's genius was not as a military tactician. He often drove his generals to distraction with wild strategic schemes, but as a master of words and morale. He understood that this war would be won not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of his people. His speeches were weapons. "We shall fight on the beaches." This was their finest hour. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. These were not mere phrases. They were a psychological bulwark against despair. He offered his people not a promise of easy victory, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He made them partners in a grand, heroic struggle. His mind, steeped in the epic narratives of history, framed the conflict as a new battle against a modern darkness, and he cast the British people as the heroes. Churchill's strategic mind was most evident in his unwavering pursuit of the Grand Alliance. From the moment Britain stood alone, he worked tirelessly to draw the United States and the Soviet Union into the war. He cultivated a close, if sometimes fraught, relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, securing vital Lend-Lease aid that kept Britain afloat. And he watched with foreboding as Soviet armies swallowed Eastern Europe, powerless to stop it. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, midway through the proceedings, he was replaced by a new prime minister after losing the British election. The man who had led his nation through its finest hour was rejected by the very people he had inspired. It was a cruel irony. Churchill's mind, a bastion of 19th century imperialism and romanticism, had won a war that ultimately spelled the end of the British Empire he so loved. But his true legacy was his demonstration that willpower, eloquently expressed, can be the most powerful weapon against overwhelming odds. A Across the Atlantic, the mind of Franklin D. Roosevelt was navigating a different, but equally complex landscape. The President of the United States was a master political operator, a man of immense charm and guile, who understood the delicate art of the possible. In the 1930s, his focus was squarely on the Great Depression. The rise of fascism in Europe was a distant concern for an America deeply committed to isolationism. Roosevelt's mind was instinctively internationalist, but he was constrained by a powerful domestic political reality. He could not lead where the American people were not willing to follow. Roosevelt's approach was of gradual, careful steps. He watched the fall of France with alarm and understood that a Nazi-dominated Europe was a direct threat to American security. His mind began working on a way to support Britain without entering the war. The result was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, a program of brilliant political innovation. He framed it as lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. It was not an act of war, but of common sense. This arsenal of democracy policy kept Britain fighting and began the massive mobilization of American industry. Roosevelt's mind was preparing the nation for a conflict he believed was inevitable, carefully shifting public opinion through his famous fireside chats and actions that tested the limits of neutrality.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, solved Roosevelt's political dilemma, but created a monumental strategic one. His famous Day of Infamy speech was a masterful piece of leadership, uniting a shocked nation overnight. But his strategic mind immediately grasped the Germany First policy. Despite the public outrage against Japan, he and his military chiefs agreed with Churchill that Nazi Germany was the more dangerous and industrially powerful foe. This was a decision of immense strategic clarity. It meant fighting a holding action in the Pacific while focusing the bulk of American power on defeating Hitler. Roosevelt's vision for the post-war world was perhaps his most significant mental contribution. He was the principal architect of the United Nations, believing that a new international organization could prevent future conflicts where the old League of Nations had failed. At the wartime conferences, his mind was focused on winning the war and securing Stalin's cooperation for this new world order. He believed he could handle Uncle Joe, appealing to his better nature and drawing the Soviet Union into a peaceful community of nations. This was, in hindsight, a profound miscalculation of Stalin's character and intentions. Roosevelt's health was failing rapidly throughout 1944 and early 1945. The ailing president, his mind still fixed on the future, died on April 12, 1945, just weeks before the fall of Berlin. He had led his nation out of depression and into a position of global leadership, but he did not live to see the peace, or to confront the Soviet challenge that his wartime partnership had helped to create. In the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, a figure of immense symbolic power, yet ambiguous political authority, presided over Japan's descent into war. Emperor Hirohito was considered a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His mind was a mystery, shielded by the layers of court ritual and the complex power structures of 1930s Japan. The real driving force for war came from the Imperial Japanese Army, an institution that had become a state within a state, driven by a fanatical belief in Kokutai, the unique national polity of Japan, and the divine destiny to lead Asia. The minds of Japan's military leaders were shaped by a potent cocktail of nationalism, racial superiority, and a warrior code, Bushido, that glorified death over surrender. They viewed the West and the European colonial powers with a mixture of resentment and contempt. The West imperial holdings in Asia were proof of their hypocrisy. They preached open doors and self-determination while holding vast colonies themselves. The Japanese military solution was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for a Japanese-controlled empire that would expel the Western powers and secure the resources, particularly oil, that the island nation desperately lacked. Emperor Hirohito's role in this process remains one of history's most debated questions. He was not an absolute dictator in the mold of Hitler. He was a constitutional monarch who traditionally reigned but did not rule. However, he was kept informed and gave his assent to critical decisions.
Historians debate whether he was a powerless figurehead swept along by the militarists or an active participant who shared their expansionist goals but worried about their recklessness. He did little to stop the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the full-scale war with China in 1937, and the brutal atrocities like the rape of Nanjing. His primary concern seemed to be the preservation of the imperial institution itself. The decision for war with the United States in 1941 was a calculated gamble born of desperation. The American oil embargo had put a stranglehold on the Japanese economy and military. The leadership faced a choice: back down and lose face, and their empire in the making, or strike a devastating blow to buy time to consolidate their gains. The attack on Pearl Harbor was that blow. The plan's architect, Admiral Osuruko Yamamoto, who had studied in America, famously worried that he could run wild for 6 months, but feared the outcome if the war dragged on. The emperor, after much deliberation, gave his final approval. The minds of Japan's leaders had chosen a war they knew they might not win, betting everything on a short, decisive conflict and the hope that America would lack the will for a long, bloody fight. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of the American character, a failure of imagination that would lead to the fiery destruction of Japan's cities and the only wartime use of atomic weapons. Inside the minds of these leaders, we find no single cause, but a toxic combination. Hitler's ideological fanaticism, Mussolini's vanity, Stalin's paranoia, Churchill's defiant romanticism, Roosevelt's pragmatic idealism, and the Japanese militarists' fatalistic nationalism. They were not gods or monsters, though some committed monstrous acts. They were fallible human beings, burdened with the prejudices, insecurities, and blind spots of their time and their own psyches. Yet their decisions, made in rooms of power, sent millions to their deaths and reshaped the globe. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the character of those who lead matters more than we can ever know. For within their minds, the fate of the world can be decided.